with Hilary Benn and the Deputy Committee Chair.
Well, good afternoon, Prime Minister. Given the events of the last 2 weeks, wouldn't it strengthen your hand in the negotiations if you put the White Paper to a vote in the House of Commons?
I think what is important is that we have set out what the government's position is, that we have got through particularly important legislation in the House of Commons. Getting the EU Withdrawal Act on the statute book was a very important step in the process of withdrawing from the European Union. We've put the White Paper, we've published the White Paper, we have begun discussing that with at the EU level, and we continue. These are negotiations. You can't constantly be setting out where we are in those negotiations. As I said, we're not going to do a running commentary on the negotiations. What is important is that this is the government's position, that's been put forward, and it has been, as we have seen in things through like the Withdrawal Act, in some of the other pieces of legislation we've put through in planning for our future in relation to being outside the European Union. The European Commission and the European Union leaders have seen the strength of our determination on this.
Well, we know, Prime Minister, it's the government's position, self-evidently. The question was whether it's Parliament's position. And isn't the problem is that everyone else watching what's going on here, including those with whom we're negotiating, is wondering whether, in fact, your proposals have the support of Parliament, and doesn't that make your job more difficult?
No, we have been very clear that these are the proposals that the government is bringing forward. These are the United Kingdom's proposals that we're taking forward, and that is being engaged with by the European Commission.
OK. Now, can you remind us how much the government is spending on preparing for a no-deal outcome?
Well, the Treasury set aside over a period of 2 years the sum of £3 billion to prepare for preparatory work, and that was allocated at the spring statement. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, explained the allocation for 2018-19 among departments. So, for example, as you might imagine, DEFRA is the department that has 310 million allocated to it for that year. HM Revenue and Customs, 260 million. Home Office, 395 million. The other big amounts, 185 million to BEIS, and then obviously other departments have some allocated.
That's very helpful.
But those sums are work that they're doing for preparing for the outcomes, and of course those outcomes are for a deal or for a no deal.
OK. Can you confirm that no deal would mean a hard border in Northern Ireland? It's a very simple question. If there's no deal, there will be a hard border.
And there isn't the sort of simple answer to that you're looking for, if I may say so.
Really?
Obviously, if we were looking at the question of a no deal, then it would be for the United Kingdom. We would need to consider what action we would take in those circumstances. The Irish government and the European Commission would need to consider what action they would take in those circumstances.
But you've put a huge amount of effort, including in your white paper, into coming up with a proposal to avoid a hard border. Presumably, precisely because, as you said to the House of Commons on the 9th of July, the friction-free movement of goods is the only way to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And therefore, if there's no deal, there can't be friction-free movement of goods. Therefore, there would be a hard border, wouldn't there?
If there is no deal, there would be decisions for the United Kingdom government to take about the action that it was taking at its borders. The European Commission is very clear that if there is no agreement in relation to customs arrangements, then there have to be checks at the border. But as I say, when you come to a circumstance, whatever the circumstances were, we would obviously need to look at the situation in which that deal was being put into place, the arrangements in which that lack of a deal was being put into place, and so forth.
But we're talking about no deal. You've just acknowledged that the Commission has said that checks would have to be put into place on the European side. Therefore, there would be a hard border, and that would be the consequence of no deal. I suppose the question is, why would that be worth it? Because you've often said we're prepared to contemplate no deal, although you don't want that outcome. Why would that be a price worth paying for Northern Ireland?
If I can just recap on what I said. I said in my first answer in relation to this that if we were in a no-deal situation, we would obviously have to consider what action we were taking, not just in relation to the Northern Ireland border, but more generally. And the European Commission would have to consider what action it was taking with its responsibilities for customs, and indeed individual governments would have to consider the action that they were taking in those circumstances. As I've said, as you know, the proposals that the European Commission have put forward so far have been based on the assumption that if you don't have that frictionless trade, there is that border in place. What I'm saying is, if we were in the circumstances of no deal, then all the parties concerned would have to consider what action they would take. But you asked me about the fact that I have said no deal is better than a bad deal. I think that is, I remain by that. I think that is right. I think a bad deal, which effectively, for example, as some have suggested, that we would be prepared to pay any price for something, I think that would not be a good deal for the United Kingdom.
You've always been very clear about that, Prime Minister. Now, there was nothing new in the White Paper on the backstop proposal for Northern Ireland, and as you know, the absence of an agreement on a backstop is currently holding up the withdrawal agreement. Now, will you be proposing that the common rule book with the EU, which you have now embraced in the White Paper, will also apply to the backstop, thus filling in the gap that you identified when you published your backstop proposals? You said we'll need something on regulations. You've now proposed a common rule book. Would you apply that common rule book to the backstop proposal?
We, as you correctly say, we have not yet finalised the discussions that we are having with the European Union on the backstop and the description of that backstop within the withdrawal agreement. Those negotiations continue. I will make the point that we have put forward a proposal for frictionless trade which deals with the Northern Ireland border issue, which I have always said, as you know, it was confirmed by the European Commission in the December joint report, that Plan A, i.e. the overall relationship between the UK and the EU, is the preferable route to take in terms of dealing with the Northern Ireland border, and that's where what we have published in our white paper. As we come to discuss with the European Union and the European Commission the withdrawal agreement, we have obviously committed to having that legally operative backstop in the withdrawal agreement, but those discussions are still taking place as to the nature of that. When
backstop. Will you complete the backstop proposal, having offered an incomplete proposal last month? When are you going to put the full proposal?
Well, the discussions and negotiations on the backstop proposal, and we remain committed to the backstop being in the withdrawal agreement, but the negotiations on those will continue, and people will see what the final details of those are when the final withdrawal agreement is able to be put to...
Right.
Put
so
to
when will
Parliament.
the question of regulatory standards relating to the backstop be addressed, which you recognise in the paper you published needed to be addressed? Will that be in the next month or two?
It will be addressed in the negotiations that are taking
place. All right. Now, if Parliament were to choose to diverge from the common rule book, and the common rule book was applying to the backstop, then wouldn't that in effect mean a return to checks on the border in Northern Ireland if there was any divergence? And if that's the case, doesn't it mean that in practice Parliament can't diverge from the common rule book?
No,
can it?
Parliament will be able to make a decision as to whether to diverge from the common rule book. There's a whole set of processes. I mean, if it is the case that if the European Union were to put forward a change to part of those rules, then there would be a process of determination as to whether that first of all affected the agreement that had been entered into, or whether it was not material to the agreement that had been entered into. Then secondly, there would be a consideration from the UK side, and we set out in the white paper a number of proposals about parliamentary involvement in that, about how that would be addressed. The question would, as I say, initially be discussed in the joint committee as to whether this was in scope. We would then look to see the degree of change that was relevant in relation to the EU's new rule. Parliament would then look at that. Parliament would, in considering this,
Prime Minister,
look at the operation of the
We've read that in the
relationship.
white paper, and we understand how the system would work.
Well, in that case, then what I'm going through is what you understand. But when Parliament came to its decision, Parliament would take into account a number of aspects of the operation of the future relationship,
Fine.
And they would also, of course, include commitments to Northern Ireland.
Okay, and finally from me, can you confirm that your proposed facilitated customs arrangement, assuming it's agreed by the EU, will be ready to go by December 2020?
The majority of what is required for this facilitated customs arrangement will definitely, as we've indicated, be in place by December 2020. There is a question as to the speed with which the repayment mechanism would be in place. And there's been, so far, the suggestion is that that could take longer to be put into place. That is yet to be finally determined. The date at which that will be possible to have in place.
So its implementation will be much quicker than the previous two proposals of the MaxFAC and the Customs Partnership, because they were going to take longer than 2020.
It would be yes, the majority of it would be in place by December 2020.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We now come to questions from the International Trade Committee and Angus Brendan McNeil.
Thank you very much, Chair. You're a survivor, Prime Minister. I often think of Gloria Gaynor when I look at you. You're doing well. The can kicking down the road has been a successful policy, really, and the government goes on much against what many pundits probably thought. Following up on the Irish border issue, the Irish Independent today has a story saying a hard border inevitable on the showdown with the World Trade Organization. Is there a hard border inevitable in Ireland? And of course, its implications for everywhere else.
What we have set out in the Chequers Agreement and detailed in more detail in the White Paper is a proposal for a facilitated customs agreement and the regulatory arrangements that would ensure that we did not have a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. This is one of the factors that we've been considering throughout this process. We have been over the last 2 years. As you know, we waited to trigger Article 50 to do some preparatory work for that. We've then been working on all of these elements in what is a complex set of negotiations.
Okay.
And we've put forward a proposal that it would deliver no hard border in Northern Ireland.
Of course, the hard border that's much talked about in Ireland is merely the EU-UK border on the island of Ireland. This is going to apply to every other border that the UK will share with the European Union. What's going to be happening at Dover? What's going to be happening everywhere else?
Well, the proposal that we have put forward, we've always said that actually...
This morning we heard the Dutch are hiring 1,000 more customs officers. They're expecting difficulty by the look of it, or at least preparing for difficulty. Are you?
Well, everybody is, and we are hiring more border officers because we're preparing for all contingencies. But the proposals that we have put forward in the Chequers Agreement, as detailed in the White Paper, set out a plan for the future relationship on customs and certain areas of regulation with the European for trade with the European Union, which would enable us not only to have a frictionless border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but also to have a frictionless border between the UK and other member states of the European Union.
Okay.
And if I may just make this point, of course, from the point of view of the Irish economy, that east-west trade between Ireland and Great Britain is, of course, a more significant element of their economy than the trade between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
The Irish say that, but of course these are borders UK to EU. So is your situation, you're out of the customs union, you're out of the single market, and you don't have borders? Is that basically what you're telling us?
Well, if you looked at the White Paper and the agreement that we came to in Chequers, you will see that the proposal we're putting forward is that we're no longer a member of the customs union, we're no longer a member of the single market. We have put forward a proposal for the common rule book in a specific area of industrial goods and agri-food, and the customs arrangement that can go alongside that, which would deliver frictionless borders.
Where else in the world does this exist?
Well, it doesn't. It's a novel idea. It is
Absolutely,
a novel idea.
Very novel
but
idea.
I would sincerely hope that you wouldn't suggest to me that the only approach that the United Kingdom government can take to this is simply to say what else exists and what can we take out of that, rather than saying, actually, what is the arrangement that we think is going to be best for the UK? Let's put that forward. And let's argue for that in those negotiations.
That might be the argument you have on one hand, others might say pie in the sky on the other hand, and we'll have to wait and see which one it is. You triggered Article 50 to leave in March 2019. You then went in Florence to ask for 24 months. The EU gave you another 21 months. Do you have enough time for your novel ideas to get yourself out of the European Union, Prime Minister?
Yes, we're all working, both sides in this negotiation are working to the same timetable. We will be leaving the EU on the 29th of March 2019, as you've indicated in your question. The implementation period, which is a period which enables businesses and government to prepare for the future relationship, will end in December 2020. We're still working to the timetable of ensuring that we have the withdrawal agreement and the sufficient detail of the future relationship agreed by October, such that that can then become before Parliament. I've always said that I think when this Parliament, and indeed I think the same will be true of the European Parliament, although their job will be a slightly different one, when this Parliament is asked to put withdrawal agreement and implementation bill legislation through the House, they will want to know what the arrangements are for the future relationship, and that's what we're working to.
So you think of enough time. Okay, and is American USA-UK trade deals still on the cards, do you think? Yes or no? Because we're hearing
yes.
Yes, okay. That's worth about 0.2% of GDP. What is your government's estimate of the loss to GDP from your exiting the EU option?
Well,
it's 5%,
often,
isn't it?
Very often, people look at this equation as if one substitutes for the other. What I'm looking to ensure... No. What I'm looking to ensure...
We get the figures, because you agreed the first figure, 0.2, very quickly. I'm looking for you to agree the 5%.
You stated the first figure of 0.2.
Well, you didn't demur from it.
What I'm looking at is ensuring that we can both maintain a good trading relationship with the European Union and also build on that with new improved trading relationships around the rest of the world. Now, obviously, one of the initial things that we'll be doing is we'll be looking at continuity of those agreements which the European Union already has with certain parts of the world, where we're a member of those, so there is no cliff edge for the businesses involved in those, and then look to improve on those agreements.
5% damage is what your government estimates, which is about 2.5 times the cost of the crash of 2008. To replicate that with the American-style agreement, you're going to need about 25 to 30 of those type agreements to make up the difference. It really is, having bought the Rolls-Royce, having crashed the Rolls-Royce, you're now going down the second-hand car shop to look for the best possible second-hand car for the United Kingdom. It's not going to make up for the damage you've chosen with your government to go for a quite hard Brexit, for the economic damage you're doing, is it?
First of all, what we are doing is delivering on a vote that was taken by the British people. Parliament voted 6-1 to give the British people a choice as to that's fine, but I'm sorry, because the alternative to what you're suggesting is actually staying in the European Union.
So you accept economic damage
No, I'm not accepting that. You are you're talking about the position we're in terms of the negotiations for leaving the European Union. The reason we're doing that is because we asked people what they wanted to do. They have said they want us to leave the EU, and that is what the government will deliver. In delivering on it, we're delivering on what people voted for, like an end to free movement, but we're also ensuring that we do it in a way that protects jobs. That's what the Chequers Agreement delivers. That's what the White Paper delivers.
We'll have a referendum in Scotland to discuss that.
Thank you. Come on now to Home Affairs and Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Can I just return to the issue of the borders? Under the proposal for the facilitated customs agreement, are you still proposing that EU countries will not have to collect any additional or different tariffs for the UK?
No, if you look at the concept of reciprocity is in the White Paper.
Yes, but
the concept of reciprocity is in the White Paper. What we are proposing is that there would be, what we propose in the White Paper is a formula arrangement, so that there would be a formula agreement for the sums of money that would be collected by the UK for those goods that were coming not just to the UK but into the European Union through the UK, and a sum of money that would be related to those goods that would enter the European Union destined for the United Kingdom.
Okay, it sounds really complicated. Just start with what happens
it's
at the border.
It's not formula agreements, the things that are involved exist
just
elsewhere.
Just start with what's happening at the border first. At our border, we will collect EU tariffs for goods that are heading to the EU. Will we or won't we expect EU countries to collect our tariffs on goods that are destined to the UK? What
we have put in the White Paper, what we expect is that EU countries, that we say EU countries. In fact, the way the EU does this is not necessarily through the individual countries in terms of the way the payments are made, but that the sums of money that would be relevant for goods that are entering the European Union for destined for the United Kingdom would be paid to the UK.
But if
so
we
there
have
would be a
different...
reciprocity in payments.
Okay, but if we have different levels of tariffs, it says very clearly, at least I thought it was clear, in page 17, however, the UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK's tariffs and trade policy at its border for goods intended for the UK. Is that still the case?
What we are proposing, but as you will see in that paragraph, earlier in that paragraph, the UK proposes a tariff revenue formula taking account of goods destined for the UK entering via the EU and goods destined for the EU entering via the United Kingdom. The important thing here is there is reciprocity in the sums of money that would be paid. So
I'm asking about what
we're saying is
a good
would not enter the European Union destined for the UK without the European Union being expected, or through the arrangement, money to be recognised as being due to the UK as a result of that.
So suppose we have different levels of tariffs. Let's suppose we have lower tariffs on goods coming from the US and Europe has lower tariffs on goods coming from New Zealand, for example. We would then collect the higher EU tariffs on the goods coming from the US when they came in through Liverpool or through wherever. Would we expect goods coming into the EU from New Zealand, would we expect the EU to collect higher tariffs for us, or would we expect them to apply their own EU tariffs at the border?
What I'm saying, and what the paragraph says, is that this is not a question of somebody physically handing cash over at the border. The way we would deal with this would be a formula revenue agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom, which would reflect the goods, what was required for goods that were entering the European Union destined for the UK, just as it would, the money relevant to the EU would reflect goods coming in to the United Kingdom and destined for the European Union.
But a payment's still got to be made somewhere. So if these goods are coming in from New Zealand and they're arriving at a port in Italy, for example, or in Spain or somewhere, and we've got a higher tariff on those goods from New Zealand, where is that higher tariff paid? Is it paid when the goods arrive in Spain or in Italy, or is it not paid when the goods arrive in Spain or Italy?
There will be, as I say, a formula agreement with the European Union in terms of the sums of money.
I'm interested in the business. The importer, when do they pay?
Importers will be under a requirement to ensure that they have paid the correct tariffs.
To Spain or to Italy?
What matters is what money comes to the United Kingdom.
I know, I just don't know how they're going to get it if they haven't paid the extra money.
Well, there's two elements. I've said to this, with having a formula, tariff revenue formula, an agreement with the European Union, which relates to the sums of money that are due from one side to the other in the movement of goods. Now,
but the formula only applies to what happens between the governments.
Yes,
what happens? When's this importer going to pay the extra money? Are they going to pay the extra money when the goods arrive in Spain or Italy, or are we going to have to charge them when those goods get transferred across from Spain across to the UK? How are we going to make sure that the importer pays the fair tariffs?
Well, we are. First of all, there is going to be a requirement on businesses to ensure that they are paying the correct tariffs. But that, I think what I'm saying is that the overall concern from the United Kingdom is surely to ensure that the arrangement we have with the European Union is relevant to and reflects the flow of goods between both, the nature of tariffs that are relevant in relation to goods coming from different places, and that money is therefore able to be exchanged between the two in relevant sums between the two.
But you can't exchange money that's not been paid. So I still don't understand. The importer when are they paying the extra tariffs? If we've got different tariffs in the UK compared to the EU, because that, as I understand it, is what you want to happen. You want us to be outside the common external tariff. You want us to have different tariffs to the rest of the EU. If we have those different tariffs, where's the money going to be paid?
Well, what matters to us in terms of having, first of all, one of the reasons for being able to have different tariffs is actually being able to lower your tariffs so that you can encourage trade around the world. So you're rather assuming that there's going to be certain circumstances in which the United Kingdom is going to say, well, actually, we're going to charge higher tariffs than the European Union is charging. What matters is that we have an agreement such that for goods that are crossing the border, the money that is paid between the European Union and the United Kingdom reflects those goods. Now, obviously, this is part of the proposal that we're putting forward to the European Union, and there will be elements of this that we will be discussing with them and negotiating in terms of exactly how that tariff revenue agreement would be entered into.
But here's the problem. So I'm really baffled as to what's going to happen and how these differential tariffs are going to work. I'm even more baffled because we've still got this statement in the white paper which says that we're not going to have the EU applying the UK's tariffs and trade policies at the border, but you accepted an amendment, the new clause 36, yesterday, 2 days ago, which requires this reciprocity, and the government will account to HMRC for those duties and taxes collected in that country on a reciprocal basis. So we don't have reciprocal arrangements, whether it's at our border in Liverpool or at the border in Spain and Italy. And isn't the problem that the reason we seem to be going round in circles on this is because don't you have a problem that you're just actually not being straight about the language and about what it is you're actually proposing? And so everybody's confused, and as a result, nobody trusts what the government is doing.
I've been very straight about the language. I've been very straight about what not just straight in saying it, but it's published in the white paper. What we are proposing is a reciprocal agreement with the European Union in relation to the exchange of tariffs that are paid on external borders for goods entering the United Kingdom destined for the EU and for goods entering the European Union destined for the United Kingdom.
And you hope this is going to be in place and working by 2021?
Good luck.
Did you want to answer?
Well, I answered the question about from our point of view, the future customs arrangement will indeed, the facilitated customs agreement will indeed be, we're aiming to negotiate for
it
that
is
to
baffling.
be.
It really is.
Sorry?
It is baffling.
We're going to move on
I'm not
now.
sure what is baffling about us exchanging sums of money that are relevant to both parties, but there we are.
We're now going to move on to the Science and Technology Committee and Norman Lamb.
I want to come on to something that we should all be able to agree on, the importance of science collaboration. But you will understand that there are a lot of people in the science community who are deeply anxious about the uncertainty that we currently have. You very helpfully talked about a far-reaching science and innovation pact. I think you now call it an accord. I don't think that makes much difference. But we haven't heard anything about the progress you've made on that. Where has it got to, and what's the timescale for getting this completed so that we can have certainty for the science community?
Well, there's first of all, we have been trying to give some certainty to the science community in terms of what is already in existence and the Horizon 22 projects.
They're worried about the future,
yes,
and planning research projects for the future beyond that.
I recognise that,
Sure.
and I recognise that was the import of your question. I just wanted to get that on the table, so to speak. We've had some exchanges with the Commission. We've had some positive exchanges with the Commission on the science and innovation front. Obviously, what we're proposing in the Accords does need to be agreed as part of the overall future relationship and the negotiation we're doing there. The timetable for that, of course, as I said in answer to an earlier question, is that we're all working to have that agreed by the autumn. October is the date that was originally set by the European Commission.
So you hope that we could have your far-reaching accord in place by the autumn?
That's what we want. What we will have in working to for the autumn is the overall agreement on the overall relationship. Within that, the science and innovation accords would be part of that, and I would hope. What I'm working for is to have sufficient detail that people have the confidence of knowing where they're going to stand for the future. There will just to be clear, that won't be an absolutely full legal text on every aspect of the future relationship.
But you've said that that should include, or that you want it to include, is your ambition to remain a participator in what will be Horizon Europe, the successor programme. And the science community sees that as vitally important. And indeed, Dr. Patrick Vallance on the radio this morning said, keeping continuity of science collaboration is an absolutely key aim that we must keep right. Is it still your ambition to be part of Horizon Europe?
We do want to. It is still an ambition that we want to make sure that we have got those science and innovation accords in, and we do continue to want to look at the question of Horizon Europe. Obviously, we have to look at exactly what Horizon Europe is going to entail.
Well, we know what the programme is. We know the details of the prospective programme. Yeah. Which we've participated in negotiating. And
we also need to know, as part of the negotiations with the European Union, we'll be discussing, of course, what the basis of a UK outside the EU involvement in Horizon Europe could be. Obviously, as you'll be very well aware, there are countries outside the European Union that are able to participate in these programmes.
And you've talked about the need for an appropriate level of influence because, we're one of the biggest contributors to the programme. What does that mean? Because the EU appears to be clear that third countries won't have a vote. And if that's the case, does that mean that we won't be part of Horizon Europe?
Well, the point is these are all will be part of the negotiations. Exactly what would the package of involvement look like? We have that ambition. We think actually that makes sense for the European Union as well, given the world-leading nature of many of our universities and much of the research that is done here in the UK. But we obviously need to negotiate as to what those parameters for our involvement would be.
Okay, now, in all of the evidence we've taken, the thing that people are most concerned about is people. The flow of the brightest and the best, I think you've described them as, and at all career levels. It's not just the top, but it's the lab technicians, it's the students, the postgrad students, and so forth. And it's not just in academia, it's in commerce and industry as well. Are you committed to ensuring that we have an immigration system in place, both for EEA citizens but also the wider world, that enables us in a seamless way to get the best people to work in this country for the good of our economy?
Well, we've always been committed to ensuring that the brightest and best can come to the UK. Free movement will end when we leave the
but when we're talking about skilled workers.
But what we will be doing is to set out, and obviously these will come before Parliament, the immigration rules that would apply for people coming from within the European Union in the future once we have control of our immigration rules for people from the European Union. Obviously we have, as you know, a set of rules that apply for those who are outside the EU at the moment. The Migration Advisory Committee has been doing a piece of work and will be reporting later this year on the input and the contribution of EU workers and impact of EU workers on the UK economy. That will provide an evidence base against which we can then bring forward the proposed immigration rules for the future.
Have you made any progress on Galileo? Because this is a vitally important project which involves a lot of UK collaboration, a lot of jobs are at stake here, quite apart from our security interests and the reason why we're involved in it in the first place.
And there continue to be difficulties on Galileo. We continue to talk to the Commission about them. What we are also doing alongside that is looking to see if we can't be a member of Galileo in the way in which we believe we should be and is important for our participation. Then we are looking at doing that, taking a project ourselves, if you like, going it alone and not, or potentially with others, and not being part of Galileo. But I recognise the significance of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We come now to European Scrutiny Committee and Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Prime Minister, when and how did you, in number 10, make substantial and unexpected changes in the White Paper proposals in the run-up to Chequers? And did you and or Ollie Robbins show the proposals to Angela Merkel and or the EU before showing them to the Cabinet? If so, this prima facie would be, I would suggest, contrary to the ministerial and the civil service codes. Did you ask the law officers for their opinion on the white paper as required by the ministerial code before the Chequers meeting? And if so, was this consultation with them, and I use the words in the ministerial code, in good time, given its critical legal and constitutional importance, and if so, when?
Well, first of all, can I lay on the head? I mean, there has been a suggestion I've seen that we actually took copies of the white paper and showed it to people outside of the United Kingdom. We did not. You ask about the ideas that are in the white paper. In fact, ideas that are in the white paper, some of the ideas that are in the white paper that perhaps have caused most debate and discussion following the Chequers agreement and the publication of the white paper were ideas that were set out as potential issues for us to look at in the Florence speech that I gave last September. There had been discussions about these throughout, and that was slightly fleshed out in the Mansion House speech that I gave earlier this year. So those proposals were there and were considered and looked at by ministers. We then decided the route that we were going to take, and we spent some time discussing that with the European Commission, and obviously in terms of the negotiations with the European Union. It became clear that that was not negotiable. Alongside that, of course, we were looking at the customs arrangements in relation to the two options that had originally been on the table, and then refining those two options to ensure that we could deliver on the frictionless trade at the border and the no border with Northern Ireland. What became clear was that it was necessary to evolve the Mansion House position, and in advance of that Cabinet meeting there was discussion about that particular issue. And I say the underlying concept was one that had been previously discussed because it was there actually in the not Lancaster House, Florence, and then in the Mansion House speeches.
And the law officers? Did you ask them for their opinion in good time as required by the ministerial code, and what was their response?
Well, as I know, Sir William, you will know, we don't normally give in public details of law officers' opinions that are given to the government. But I can assure you that all those who needed to be involved in this and who needed to be to look at this from their responsibilities were involved.
And that did include the law officers, as a matter of fact.
As a matter of fact, the law officer sits around the cabinet table and is somebody who is consulted through that process.
Thank you. Now, the Common Rule Book is an EU rule book. The former president of the EFTA Court has just very recently, the last few days, stated that under it, and I quote, the UK would recognise that the ECJ is supreme on the interpretation of EU law, close quote, and under the independent arbitration system, we would agree to refer questions to the ECJ. The ECJ will determine not only the interpretation, but also the outcome of any disputes. Now, under the similar Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova treaties, the ECJ in practice decides, not the arbitrators. So given what the former president of the EFTA Court has so recently stated, and I think it's generally understood that he understands this stuff very well, how on earth could you argue that the white paper does discontinue ECJ jurisdiction, and how do you reconcile, as I asked you in the House the other day, the repeal of the 1972 Act with the continuing application of the functions of the European Court of Justice to the UK, when, as you know only too well, Section 3 of the European Community Act 1972 is the jurisdiction of the European Court over the UK in domestic law, and under the Repeal Act, that is actually going to be repealed on exit day.
We acknowledge in the white paper the role that the European Court of Justice has in being the determinant of the interpretation of European Union law. And that is acknowledged in the white paper. But we will not be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. through the proposals that are in here, as we say, in those cases where there is a dispute which involves the interpretation of EU law, and in the industrial goods acquis, of course, there is a significant volume, a significant amount of case law already in existence in relation to the interpretation of those rules, many of which have been stable, have not changed for some time. Then it will be possible through those processes to ask for an opinion from the European Court of Justice on the interpretation of EU law. The European Court of Justice would not determine any dispute that takes place, that is in question at the time. The court of one party cannot be the arbiter in terms of a dispute between two parties. It would be, obviously we've got if you like, the hierarchy of determinations of disputes that takes place. The European Court of Justice, by definition, as the arbiter of EU law, would have an influence, but it would have an influence in cases even when we had no deal with the European Union. Because if you were a business that was exporting to the European Union and doing so on the basis of EU rules, and there was a dispute, your importer, for example, raised a dispute about whether you had met those EU rules, the arbiter of that EU rule would be the European Court of Justice. In terms of disputes that are breaking before the courts in the UK, they will go to the UK courts, they will be determined by the UK courts.
I understand that is the direction, the trajectory of your answer, but I still leave on the table the questions I've asked, and I remain unconvinced at the moment, but we shall continue this, I've no doubt, in due course.
I suspect, Sir William, you and I may have some further lengthy discussions on some of these legal
now,
thank you. I think we're going to have to move on to the next section. Thank you very much. So the next chair is Bernard Jenkins. Sir Bernard Jenkins, the chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Prime Minister.
Afternoon.
The White Paper talks about stepping up plans for no deal, and so far there appears to have been some reticence about making announcements about what is being prepared for in the event of no deal. So what's the basis for deciding when to announce what is being done in preparation for no deal?
Well, there were two approaches two aspects that we've looked at. The first is obviously the work that needs to be done by the government in determining the preparations, and then the second is the point at which it is important to be able to ensure that others outside government who would need to be involved are able to have the information that they need. I was going to look. We're not yet on the debate later this afternoon, but the Secretary of State for exiting the EU will be setting out today that over August and September we're going to be releasing a number of technical notifications to set out what UK citizens and businesses need to do in a no-deal scenario. So making much more public awareness of the preparations. We imagine there are going to be around 70 of those technical notices that will be issued. So that's, if you like, taking a next step. The Cabinet did agree that we needed to step up our no-deal preparations, but this is part of those no-deal preparations, is making those technical notices available to those who obviously need to know that information.
Thank you. So if you've ruled out the option of negotiating an FTA with the European Union because they won't negotiate with us on the basis of without the backstop. They won't countenance an FTA without the backstop. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, yes, if I may but this is where language is important. If we talk about a free trade agreement, then the European Union has a single concept of what a free trade agreement is. Mm-hmm. So it's like Canada, that's a free trade agreement. What we're talking about in here is a much wider and more ambitious overall partnership with them. Mm-hmm. So obviously, at its heart is a free trade area with the EU. But that's why we don't use the term free trade agreement. But you're right, the two options that were on the table from the EU were on the one hand EEA plus, free movement, customs union, and which I think would not reflect those. And on the other was a free trade agreement that actually was less good than the Canadian free trade agreement, but with effectively the border down the Irish Sea.
One of the reasons you've given for not going for a Canada plus free trade agreement is that they won't negotiate with us on the basis of Northern Ireland remaining in the same customs area as the rest of the United Kingdom. They won't do that, will they?
Their proposal was for a free trade agreement which actually split Northern Ireland off from Great Britain.
So if we have a WTO Brexit, with or without an agreement, a withdrawal agreement, can you give us an assurance that it will be on the basis of a WTO Brexit that is for the whole of the United Kingdom, and there is no question of splitting Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom under those circumstances?
Well, I have been, I've said on many, many occasions that one of the targets, one of the aims that I have in relation to the negotiations that we have is to ensure that we retain the United Kingdom together. I believe that is important. I believe our union is very precious. So I will certainly be working to ensure that we are able to maintain, keep the United Kingdom together. As I said in response to the earlier questions,
that's fine.
In a no-deal scenario, of course, we will have to consider what action we take. Others will have to consider what action they take.
The no-deal planning, or the WTO Brexit planning, is planning for an invisible frontier in Northern Ireland.
The planning that is taking place at the moment, the issue of what happens in relation to that, is an element that we have to be looking at as we're undertaking the no-deal planning. Yes. The preparatory work that is being undertaken across a whole range of departments and a whole range of ways.
Simple, Prime Minister.
But we have, I'm being careful in answering, because I've already answered a question like this, and I don't want there to be any misunderstanding between the answers that I'm giving to the same question.
But is the government planning for a no-frontier, invisible customs frontier in Northern Ireland? Because you have to. That's part of the no-deal planning.
As we look at the no-deal planning, one of the issues that we have to look at is one of the elements that we are looking at as part of our no-deal planning is that whole question of the border in Northern Ireland.
Okay, I don't think we're going to get any further on that one. And for matters such as the regulation of chemicals, aviation safety, food safety, and indeed medicines, which the House of Commons voted on yesterday, presumably no-deal planning includes draft legislation in order to provide for regulation of those products in our own market. And when are we going to see that legislation?
No-deal planning does involve looking at any legislative requirements that are needed for these points. There is, I don't have a timetable for any required legislation at the moment. We have already put through some legislation that is relevant in a no-deal scenario in terms of our preparations for leaving the EU. But there is work that is undertaken, for example, in the relation to EASA, in terms of ensuring you would be looking, for example, there at probably a set of bilateral agreements. And the Department of Transport is looking at that.
But I mean, we will have to probably use the provisions under the EU Withdrawal Act. And we'll have to have regulations under that Act in order to replace those functions. And let's hope that they give us those bilateral agreements, because it would be very destructive and vindictive if they did not. But when do you think we will see those draft regulations or draft acts of Parliament, draft bills?
Well, there are some of the look. There's going to be a whole range of there'll be a whole range of primary and secondary legislation that will be being brought forward over time, obviously. There are a number of, as I said, we've already passed, obviously, the Withdrawal Act, the Nuclear Safeguards Bill, the Sanctions Bill. We're expecting to lay approximately 40 EU exit SIs before recess. The work is ongoing. There is a significant number of SIs that need to be laid in all of these areas.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister.
Thank you. We come on to the Transport Committee now, and Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you. Prime Minister, I'm sure that, like many people, you're looking forward to jetting off on holiday. We even understand you were quite keen to get away early. Obviously, one of the things happens is that people, when they come back from their holidays, they want to book their flights for next year, and at the moment that's looking very uncertain. Last autumn, the Secretary of State was confident that the government would have made clear progress by this summer on aviation, but we've yet to see anything concrete. How close are we to having the necessary post-Brexit aviation arrangements in place to retain access to the EU's single aviation market?
Well, as we've set out in the White Paper, we want to, as part of the future relationship, explore options that would enable the UK to continue to participate in EASA as a non-EU member state. We're moving at pace in terms of negotiations, as I've said, in relation to the future framework, because we want that to be sufficiently complete by the autumn of this year. Not legal text, obviously full legal text to follow thereafter. We believe that what is in this white paper is the right package we can put forward. As I've said, what the Department of Transport are also doing are looking at what would happen in a no-deal scenario and what arrangements would need to be placed in a no-deal scenario in order to ensure that
grounded planes are in no one's interest.
No,
we were told
exactly.
They're very unlikely. So you've said now potentially autumn, and I know, does autumn mean September? Does it mean October? Does it mean November? Does it mean December? What's holding up progress on a deal on this vital area?
Oh, it's going to be part of the future relationship. The future relationship has been put, which we published in the white paper, has been put to the European Union. We've started having discussions with the European Union on the basis of that future relationship. The timetable that everybody is working to is to have that future relationship agreed in sufficient detail by October, such that when this Parliament looks at withdrawal agreement and implementation bill, it will know what the details of the future relationship will be. That's the timetable that we're working to.
The Secretary of State confirmed that the aviation industry would need comfort that we're making progress by next summer, last October, he told us that, when it was this summer. Well, we're well into summer. Shouldn't we have had some of those things nailed down by now?
Well, as I say, the Department of Transport is working with the aviation industry to ensure that the necessary arrangements will be in place. We have made a specific proposal in here about EASA and participation in EASA as part of the future relationship, and that future relationship is being negotiated, as I said, with that timetable that was set of October. It is, as you say, it's in everybody's interest to ensure that the planes can still fly. I think that's not just in our interest, it's in the interests of others in the EU 27.
Progress by summer, and now you're saying that's slipped to the autumn.
No, I'm not saying that progress has slipped to the autumn. I'm saying this is an ongoing negotiation in a variety of levels. The future relationship is being negotiated with the European Commission with a view to that agreement by October. The Department of Transport have also been discussing with a number of countries the arrangements that could be put in place if there is no agreement on a multilateral basis with the United Kingdom for those proposals, to ensure that whatever the outcome is, that the planes can still fly.
So are we in negotiations on bilateral agreements with each of the 27 EU countries in addition to other international bodies?
We're in discussion where it is necessary to be in discussion to ensure that if there is no deal, this is part of no deal preparations, that the planes can fly. But if there is, what we're proposing here is an arrangement that would enable that to continue to happen in the circumstances in which we have a deal, as part of the deal. Alongside that, I mean, it's not just the Department of Transport. Obviously, the Civil Aviation Authority is also working with the aviation sector. It's making the preparations that are necessary for it. Obviously, we propose participation in EASA, but it's also making the preparations necessary were it to be the case that it had to operate outside EASA.
OK. Why hasn't the government got on and struck a good aviation deal with the US, with some concessions if necessary, to leverage progress with the EU and provide some certainty to the airline industry and passengers? Are there sticking points in negotiations with the United States, and if so, what's holding up progress on the deal with the US on open skies?
We've had a number of rounds of negotiations with the United States on this issue. We're confident that we will be reaching an agreement with them.
And when are we expecting? Wouldn't it have been good to have got that deal in place in order to put more pressure on the EU to reach agreement about the UK-EU arrangements?
We will conduct the negotiations and put the arrangements in place when they need to be put in place.
So does that mean that people, when they come back from their holiday, perhaps in a few weeks' time, they're going to be buying flights, or they might be thinking about booking next year's holiday, and they really don't know whether those flights will operate or not, whether there'll be any arrangement in place to give them the certainty about booking their holiday?
Well, there are, if as you will recall, first of all, we do look at what is going to be in place post March 2019, but of course we also have an implementation period up to the end of December 2020. And we are looking to the relationship that will be in place at the end of that implementation period. Some things could be put in place at an earlier stage within that implementation period. The Department of Transport is working with the aviation sector, with governments within and outside the European Union, and also, as we've put forward, this is for a negotiation with the EU27 collectively. We think that's the right way forward with the deal, but we are making the preparations necessary to ensure that whatever the circumstances, whatever happens in terms of the outcome of the negotiations, we still have those arrangements for planes to fly.
So book your flight at your own risk, I think. Thank you.
Very concerning. Thank you. Moving on now to the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, and Neil Parish.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and good afternoon, Prime Minister. I think the answer is to come to the West Country to holiday and not worry about the flights. There must be times when you feel that you're damned if you negotiate with the EU and you're damned if you don't. And so I actually very much welcome your decision at Chequers and the Cabinet and the White Paper on agri-food, because I think rules need to be dealt with. We've got 30% of our manufacturing industry in this country is food and drink. Much of that food is grown here and under very good welfare conditions and environmental conditions. Also, the Northern Ireland border, I think, is and the Republic, much of the trade between the two is food, and it's perishable and it crosses the border several times. But my actual question to you is on fishing. And that is, at the moment the fishing industry it contributes 1.3 billion to the economy, 34,000 jobs, and 708,000 tonnes of fish are caught, and we do process a lot of that. So to our coastal communities and fishermen, it's very important. But the issue is that as we leave the EU and we become an independent coastal state, at the moment they take something like 6 times the amount of fish from our waters as we take from theirs. And so it's an ace card, if you like, in our pack as we negotiate. Now, our fishermen want to make sure they get their fish back. And what they want to hear, very clearly from you, is that as we do this negotiation, they're not going to have their fish negotiated away, because we can not only get that fish back, but we can also actually build up our coastal communities, our processing, and it can be a really positive step from leaving the European Union. So, this is a reassurance I seek.
Well, first point, we will be out of the common fisheries policy, and
yes.
we will come out of the common fisheries policy, and we will be acting as an independent coastal state.
Yes.
Of course, there are issues about actually fishing, and then there's the
yes.
question of fishing products and the access to markets in relation to fishing products. But in terms of the access to waters that our fishermen would have, I mean, we want to be sitting there as an independent coastal state, able to make, obviously, as you'll be aware, there are annual negotiations.
Yeah.
Not just, obviously there's the EU structure within the common fisheries policy, but more generally annual negotiations about access to waters, and we will be part of that as an independent state. And we are very careful at the way in which fishing has been approached in the White Paper, so that it is separate from the question of that other elements of the economic partnership, precisely because I recognise the concern that the fishing industry had in the UK when we went into the European.
That's right.
EC,
there's no doubt that the fishing industry lost out dramatically. I think it's just that fishermen are bound to be slightly worried that it's tempting when you're sitting down round the negotiating table, there's some sticking points on other issues on trade, that you start to negotiate away some of that extra fish. And I accept that it may take 1 or 2 years to get there, but the fishermen want to be absolutely certain they're going to get their fish back and it's not going to get traded away.
No, we are going to be ensuring that the control of our natural resources is distinct from the negotiation of the future economic partnership.
So the fishermen can be assured that they're going to get their fish back.
Separate negotiation.
So
it'll be a separate negotiation, it'll
yeah.
be a separate part of the agreement.
Right, so therefore it's not going to be a bargaining tool. You can say that quite clearly as we negotiate out of the EU, because the EU want greater access to our fish because they've got it at the moment, so they're bound to try and play hardball on it.
We want this will be a separate agreement, a separate part of the negotiations that we're undertaking with them. This is not going to be jumbled in with the other elements of the trade relationship in the way that it was in the past.
So fishermen can rest easy in their beds.
We want to ensure that, as you say, we not only restore the independence of the UK in terms of determining access to its waters, but we also have the opportunity, as you say, to see our fishing communities being built up and the benefits that will bring.
And of course, the very final question is that as we get those fishing rights back and that fish back, of course, the quid pro quo is a lot of that is traded into the European Union. So therefore, the deal on making sure the agri-food market works on an extremely perishable product is even more important.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we move on to the next section on air quality, can I just ask you a further point about contingency planning? Because you've mentioned in an earlier answer to Sir Bernard that you'll be issuing technical notices in August and September to those who need to know. What about the wider public? What sort of information will you be giving the wider public about all the different contingencies you're planning for in the event of no deal? And the costs that would be involved in that? Will you be very clear and transparent with everybody about the range of areas where you will be making preparations and making that information available to the public?
Well, I think we will be making more information available generally about the preparations that are being made. The technical notices are obviously very specific to those who need to consider how they personally or their business is preparing for the potential circumstance of no deal. Mm-hmm. But by making those available, I mean, obviously that will be part of in making more information available more generally on the preparations that are taking place.
But as Lillian Greenwood has pointed out, there are very many wide-ranging areas in which no deal would not be better than a bad deal, where there could be very significant impacts on individuals. Will you be setting those out so that the public can see what the potential implications could be? I mean, we've, for example, on the Health Committee looked at very many implications. For example, if we don't have access to the European health insurance card after we leave the European Union in the event of no deal whatsoever, it would effectively mean that people with long-term health conditions would be uninsurable to travel to the European Union. Are these the kinds of areas that you'll be laying out to people?
Well, I think if I may, there's an issue here where we're looking to negotiate a deal and negotiate that by October. Mm. So, and at that point, of course, the question will come to Parliament as to we have the meaningful vote. We then have the potential waive, the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill. At the point at which it is, and at that point, with a deal and an agreed deal, then obviously it will become clear to people what the future relationship is going to be and the basis of that future relationship. I think if you're asking me to say, are we going to say to people here and now, if there is no deal, you will not be able to do A, B, and C. I mean, what preparedness for no deal is about is making sure that government, that business, that those who have to take actions to prepare for no deal are able to do that, and do that in a timely way, because some of these may be actions which would take time to put into place.
That's right, but it's also about letting the public know well in advance what the kinds of issues will be arising for every government department and for them in their everyday lives as well.
Well, I think there's at the point, if it were to be the case, we're working for a deal. We're working for a good deal.
We all appreciate that.
If it were to be the case that we were to be in a no-deal scenario, then obviously the information that it would be necessary for the public to have would be made available to them.
But the point is that it looks as if we're getting closer towards the possibility of no deal. Everyone appreciates that you would like to achieve a good deal. We all realise that. but this is about setting out very clearly what the consequences of no deal would be, what the planning necessary for that would be, and what the potential costs would be, so that that's very clear to the public.
Well, you based your question on an assumption that said that we were getting closer to a no-deal scenario. I don't believe that is the case. We have put forward a proposal for what the future relationship should be. We believe the future relationship should be with the European Union, and we're in negotiations on the basis of that. The timetable that I've set out in answer to other questions still remains in relation to working to having sufficient detail of this for agreed by October.
Okay, so I accept you don't see accept the premise of my question, but there is still that growing possibility. I feel that we could end up with a no-deal scenario. And my question was, will you be laying out for the public what the consequences of that will be very clearly?
Well, if we are in a no-deal scenario, then we will lay out the consequences for the public. What we are doing at the moment is working for a deal.
Yes,
where
no,
the
I
government's,
appreciate that, but
what we're doing is working for a deal.
Yes.
And that is the basis on which the Chequers Agreement was made, that's the basis on which the White Paper is made, it's the basis on which we've started discussions with the European Union. So at this point, what we're doing is saying we will ensure, as we step up our no-deal preparations, we will ensure that those technical notices are issued over August and September, so that those who need to have that information have that information.
You've made that clear. Prime Minister,
with due respect, I think what you're asking me to do is to do something else, which is to set out the argument for no deal versus the argument for a deal, rather than actually saying we're working for a deal.
No, I'm asking
we'll
you,
make sure that
Prime
those
Minister,
who
with
know...
respect, that's not... I'm asking you to set out for the public, because I think sometimes the public don't realise the scale of the issues that we would be facing, and the costs and the absolute necessity that we start planning now, because time is getting so short. So I guess my request to you is, will you agree to publish this so that the public can see what the consequences are and what you're planning for?
What we will be doing is ensuring that more information is available on the preparations the government is making for no deal, that we publish the technical notices so that those who need to make the preparations for no deal are able to do so.
You've made that clear, Prime Minister. My concern was for the wider public understanding what the consequences are. But anyway, we're going to move on now to an entirely different subject.